Hi everyone! For those who haven't met me in any classes, my name is Gabby, and I will be talking about Freud's historical influence on neurology and psychopharmacology. I will also have an accompanying PowerPoint for anybody who's more of a visual learner. So let's jump right into it. In the field of psychology, we often talk about Freud's psychoanalytical theory and his contributions to therapeutic services. However, prior to his creation of psychoanalysis, Freud worked as a contributor to neurology and psychopharmacology. So let's go back to the very beginning of Freud as a professional. Sigmund Freud attended medical school at the University of Vienna and was interested in studying neurology. His first publications were on the nervous systems of fish. He studied various aquatic physiologies, such as the lobes of brains in eels and nerve roots in the spinal cords of amniocytes. It's a bit odd to think that the Freud we know today started out as a fish researcher. However, it was this work that inspired him to move on to human neurology. In a letter to a colleague after his publications on fish, Freud wrote, "I am preparing myself for real profession, flaying of animals or torturing of human beings, and I find myself more and more in favor of the former." Although the quote is creepy, this was his way of declaring that he would be moving on to study the human nervous system. Freud went on to publish a case study about a patient with a cerebral hemorrhage and scurvy after his colleague Ernest Brooke encouraged him to use his skills there. In this case study, Freud evaluated this patient while they were lying on their deathbed and was noted to have taken notes almost on the hour of the changes in this patient's neurobiology and physiology. This publication was a massive success for him, and it allowed him to produce research on the medulla oblongata, which is the part of your brain in charge of autonomic functions. The medulla oblongata was largely ignored in most research up to Freud's time. His uncovering of the functions of the medulla oblongata pioneered further research on this structure. Shortly after his work on the medulla oblongata, Freud invented a microscopic staining technique that allowed scientists to view a more detailed image of nerve fibers. This technique utilized gold chloride. The results of his staining technique intensely improved upon previous staining procedures being used. Freud used his technique to study neurofibrillary tracts between the brainstem and the cerebellum. He was particularly interested in the medulla oblongata as it relates to this as well. Freud became one of the first people to promote the idea that the nervous system is composed of neurofibrillary structures, and he was one of the first people to draw images of said neurofibrillary structures. His technique was not used for very long after his creation, as it inspired someone else to create an even better technique, but it did give researchers a bit of a head start in understanding neurons and neurofibrillary connections. Moreover, his staining work that brought him to the discovery of neurofibrillary structures was overshadowed by a publication by another scientist entitled The Neurodoctrine. Unfortunately, this doctrine came out 7 years after, and because it actually named the neurofibrillary structure, Freud's work was completely ignored. As you could probably tell based on common knowledge of his history, Freud had a diverse array of interests. Despite the fact that he was still working on researching the medulla oblongata, Freud became curious about psychopharmaceutical drugs as a therapeutic treatment. This is something many of you may have known from the previous course material. After about a year of working at the Vienna General Hospital, Freud decided to treat his friend and colleague Fleischl-Marxau. Fleischl-Marxau developed a morphine addiction after receiving morphine during his healing process. He had his thumb amputated, and so they gave him morphine to deal with the pain. Inspired by Native American accounts on the advantages of cocaine, Freud decided to treat Fleischl-Marxau with the substance. The goal was to substitute the harmful substance Fleischl-Marxell was addicted to with a potentially beneficial substance. Of course, we have to understand that during this time, cocaine was not understood to be harmful. Freud based his approval of the drug based on accounts that said it improved focus and productivity. Moreover, cocaine was a difficult to obtain luxury for the medical field. Because of that, there was not a lot of research on the substance. At first, Fleischl-Marxell had a positive reaction to the cocaine, as it was working to wean him off the morphine. Freud quickly published his results in a piece of literature called Über Coca, which translates to On Coca or On Cocaine. In On Coca, Freud recommended that medical practitioners utilize cocaine in the treatment of morphine addiction, alcohol addiction, asthma, and as a local anesthetic. The latter I will discuss later. However, it was the first time that anyone really recommended cocaine as a local anesthetic, and it certainly inspired medical techniques even to this day. Quickly after the publication of On Coca, morphine addicts began to take Freud's advice and injected themselves with cocaine as a means to treat their addiction. This right here is a picture of a cocaine prescription from Freud. As we all can anticipate, this did not end well. People all over Europe ended up dealing with a double addiction of morphine and cocaine. As for Fleischl-Marxell, his morphine addiction ended up intensifying after the publication of On Coca, and he eventually died of an overdose. In fact, many of Freud's family and friends who he quickly prescribed cocaine to succumbed to addiction and suffered because of it. This gave Freud a bit of a sour reputation, but it did not end his career, because Freud refuted criticism by claiming that he never told morphine addicts to inject the cocaine, which is technically true. Shortly after publishing On Coca, Freud published a book entitled On Aphasia, a Critical Study. During this time period, scientific understanding of aphasia was incredibly inaccurate, and Freud recognized this. In his book, Freud divulged all existing information on each of the known aphasias and opposed a theory that was respected at the time on the anatomical localization of aphasia. At the time, it was believed that aphasia could be found in certain parts of the brain, meaning only specific parts of the brain dealt with the aspects that aphasia messed with. Freud encouraged future researchers to view the brain as one cohesive organ rather than a bunch of unique pieces that serve very specific functions. This was a very modern belief that, although accurate, wasn't highly regarded until after his passing. Soon after publishing On Aphasia, Freud published a book on the neurology of autism, which at the time was called cerebral paralysis. While studying autism, Freud discovered that cerebral paralysis was not localized to any particular part of the brain. This finding is what inspired him to abandon neuroscience and eventually pursue psychoanalysis rather than neurology and psychopharmacology. He was frustrated at his advanced ideologies of the brain in comparison to other neuroscientists of the time. After beginning his career of studying cerebral paralysis, Freud quickly shifted gears to advance our understanding of neural networks. In his manuscript entitled Project for a Scientific Psychology, Freud describes presynaptic inhibition. Unbeknownst to Freud at the time, the manuscript rendered base knowledge for neuroplasticity and the processes of learning and memory. In fact, this manuscript is still used to describe neuroplasticity and connections in the brain to young neuropsychological students. This was so lost on Freud that although he wrote the manuscript in the 1890s, it was not published until after his passing in the 1950s. It's easy to forget about Freud's early career, given the circumstances and absurdity of his later theories and all of his interesting publications. Freud helped pave the path for future research on the brain as a major organ in the central nervous system. He was a pioneer of many modern schools of neurological thought, and his understanding that the brain is a complex organ was way ahead of its time. Without him, the ability to view neurons on a microscopic level would have been severely delayed, and we would not have known as much about neurons as we do now. We can joke about and criticize his use of cocaine as a psychopharmaceutical drug, but doctors today actually still use a derivative of cocaine to stop bleeding. Although his neurological work was severely underappreciated in his time, modern historians can look back and thank Freud for his vigor and passion that allowed us to be where we are today. Thank you for watching this, and here are my sources.